Hello everybody, my name is Bailee, and for my final project I am going to be looking at the serial killer named Richard Trenton Chase. He was a serial killer in Sacramento in the 1970s. He has a famous name, the Dracula Killer, as well as the Vampire of Sacramento, which are very fitting to his activities. So just a little bit of definition for the rest of the slides. The term serial killer by the FBI means a series of 3 or more killings, not less than one of which was committed within the United States, having common characteristics such as to suggest the reasonable possibility that the crimes are committed by the same actor or actors. Having common characteristics is definitely in the realms of Richard's habits, which we will discuss later on. So just a little bit of a background, who was Richard? He was born in 1950. This puts him in his late 20s when he started his murders. He grew up in a very strict household with abusive parents. They abused him not only mentally but also physically. They did later divorce, but his time spent with parents that were abusive definitely took a toll on him. He did have some mental illnesses that he suffered from. Schizophrenia, rage, and depression. Due to this, he was in and out of mental institutions in his teenage years. He also battled addiction, not only with weed and LSD, but also with alcohol as well. He did end up getting a high school diploma, barely. He averaged C's and D's in most of his classes. And just some early indicators from his childhood that could have led us in the direction of being a serial killer. He kept to himself, very loner tendencies. He actually killed a lot of animals in his childhood, and he wasn't able to keep an intimate relationship romantically or even with friends. So just a little bit about the beginning of his trouble that could have led us to think that he would have these problems. So as I said earlier, he was in and out of psychiatric institutions. One of them was in a mental ward, and he was admitted because he was found injecting blood from rabbits into his system with a syringe. The nurses, doctors, and other patients were very fearful of his behavior. He was aggressive towards the staff and other patients. And while he was in there, he would actually catch birds, bite their heads off, and then drink their blood. However, after some time, he was released back into society. He did get his apartment. His mother paid for his rent. He did have roommates for a while, but due to his activities, they soon left him. His activities would include killing neighborhood pets as well as personal pets, and then putting them in a blender and drinking that. The police were aware of his activities when they pulled him over and he was just covered in blood. They figured out that it was from a cow, and he was released without any other notices, I guess. It does make me wonder if they had further investigated him and noticed that something was wrong with him, if they could have stopped him from his future horrible acts, but for them it didn't raise any red flags. So he later turned to human victims. Over the course of his career, for lack of a better term, he killed 6 people. They ranged from 1 month old to the early 50s. The oldest one was killed in a drive-by shooting. That was also his first victim, and that didn't really fit the other characteristics of his victims. 4 out of the 6 victims were killed all in the same evening, and they were all related, with aunts, a mom, and then the child, which is the 1 month old, the youngest. The calendar in his house actually indicated that he was going to target 44 more victims. He never specifically identified who he was going to target, but the detectives thought that due to his calendar that was marked today in red ink, that he would kill 44 more. They thought this because the victims that he had killed in the past were also marked with the same today. And all of this killing actually was in the span of 2 months. So going back to kind of the definition that the FBI gave us with the signature of the killings, all of his bodies that he killed, besides the one with the drive-by shooting, were drained of blood, and that is how he got his name, actually. He also suffered from necrophilia and cannibalism, as he would do those acts while killing. Like many other serial killers, he had a history and a present in trespassing. The unlocked doors was an invite in for him. And that goes back to the non-specific victims and the 44 more potential victims. It was honestly just whoever had their door unlocked. He thought of that as an invite inside. So this is kind of the end of Richard's career and life. He was finally identified by someone who he actually went to high school with. She used the drawing that the artist did and noticed that the person, Richard, was very skinny in the face, likely due to his cannibalism. So he was taken into custody. A year later, he had his trial. His lawyers tried to get him out of his situation by claiming insanity, which would likely be true. But he was found guilty anyways for 6 murder counts, and he was sentenced to death. Unfortunately, he was unable to fulfill his death sentence by the hands of the correctional facility because he committed suicide by stashing his antidepressants in his jail cell until he had enough, and he killed himself through overdose. He died on December 26th, so 2 years after he was taken into custody. Looking back, just some signs that could have been seen before he killed his victims. He obviously had some psychological issues with the depression, rage, and schizophrenia. From a sociological standpoint, however, we can look back and notice signs in his childhood. Not only were his parents divorced, which can be taxing on a person, but he also was abused by them mentally and physically. His childhood and his teenage years were a sign. He wasn't able to keep a long-term relationship, and he did not benefit from the time he spent in the psych wards. That definitely took a toll on his behaviors. Professor Wilson would classify him as a disorganized type of serial killer. The signs of this were that his murder scenes were very chaotic. He would leave the bodies dismembered, which is another way of saying he depersonalized the victims. He was also not a super smart serial killer. He barely passed his high school with averaging C's and D's, below average IQ. All of these are signs of a disorganized type of serial killer. Wilson would also say that he was a lust subtype of disorganized serial killer. This means that he wasn't out for revenge or ridding the world of evil, but he was fantasy-driven towards the kill and his actions of being sexually charged during and after the kill. So due to the way Richard conducted his murders, there's been a lot of media on him. There are a couple movies, some documentaries, and plenty of books. I just want to point out that I think it's important to remember that he was real and shouldn't be made into just a movie character out of respect to his victims. But in conclusion, not only did Richard's psychological issues lead him to his lifestyle, but we can also blame some of his surroundings, as well as the institutions such as the psych ward and the police force. His actions fit the characteristics of the definition of a serial killer, and that is one of the reasons why I chose to do this project on him specifically. Thank you. And here are my references.